Some places feel like they've been forgotten by time. Others feel like they want to be. That's the kind of place Silver King had become. Once a modest waterfront resort just west of Port Angeles, Washington, it had long since slipped out of memory by the summer of 2008. The cabin stood hollow, half swallowed by moss and ivy. The wooden boardwalk that once led beachgoers to the water now cracked under the weight of silence. People had stopped coming, and the land seemed grateful for the solitude. On August 5, 2008, someone disturbed the quiet. A beachgoer, the sheriff's office never released their name, had taken a walk along the shoreline near the old resort. The tide had receded, and with it, the salt air had uncovered something resting near a pile of driftwood. A single athletic shoe, dark and water-worn, lying awkwardly in the sand. It wasn't alone. Tucked inside, encased in a damp, clinging sock, was a human foot. The scene that followed was clinical but surreal. Deputies from the Clallam County Sheriff's Office responded first. They secured the area, unsure of what they were looking at. Medical examiners from King County were brought in to assess the remains. The foot was real. It was human. And it hadn't been there long, not long in the forensic sense, at least. The shoe had preserved the tissue better than bare exposure would have. There were no signs of violence. No apparent trauma. It appeared the foot had separated naturally during decomposition, as sometimes happens in long-term water exposure. Still, even with a body part in hand, investigators had little to go on. The shoe, a men's size 11, was mass-manufactured. The sock, generic. There were no distinctive tattoos, scars, or anything else that might offer a name. No other remains turned up nearby, despite several grid searches in the following days. For weeks afterward, the sheriff's office received calls and tips, none of them fruitful. The DNA extracted from the tissue was clean enough to run through Cody's and other databases. No matches. Nothing. I came across the story years later, buried in an old newspaper archive, just a few paragraphs at the bottom of a page. It caught my attention not because of what was found, but because of what wasn't. No identity. No cause of death. No narrative. Just a foot in a shoe, and the vast, unknowable Pacific behind it. The locals still remember. Not vividly, not always correctly, but they remember. Some say it was a prank. Others believe it was part of something bigger, a string of disappearances that would make headlines in the years that followed. But in 2008, there was only one. And for a long time, it stayed that way. Sometimes, the ocean gives things back. Not in full, just in pieces. And sometimes, those pieces are all you get. That foot sat in an evidence locker for 15 years. No name. No past. No resolution. Just a question waiting for science to catch up. And eventually, it did. For the next 15 years, the foot remained in a stainless steel drawer, labeled and logged, tucked away in the archives of the Clallam County Sheriff's Office. It became one of those quiet cases, the kind that don't scream for attention but don't quite let go either. Detectives moved on. Staff changed. New files piled higher. But the foot stayed. In the early days of the investigation, everything that could be done was done. DNA had been collected and profiled, then entered into Cody's, the combined DNA index system. It came back with nothing. No hits. No familial connections. Whoever this person was, they didn't exist, not in the ways law enforcement had to find them. They tried missing persons databases across the Pacific Northwest. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of files were reviewed. Men reported missing in Washington, Oregon, British Columbia. Cases from the mid-2000s. Some names seemed promising, but the shoe didn't match. The estimated time of death didn't fit. The DNA ruled them out. It was like chasing a shadow through fog. Every time they thought they had something, it disappeared on closer inspection. And then the case began to sink. Not because anyone gave up, but because there simply wasn't anything left to try. No more physical evidence. No blood. No other bones. No clothes. Just a waterlogged sneaker and a sliver of genetic code with no home. Over time, the case was referred to as the Silver King Foot, an almost folkloric phrase that made its way into internal memos and backroom conversations. In 2011, a detective briefly reopened the file after reading about a similar case across the border in British Columbia. Nothing came of it. In 2014, a different forensic analyst requested a re-examination of the DNA using more advanced sequencing. The results were cleaner, but still, no match. Meanwhile, more feet began appearing along the Salish Sea coastline. A left foot in British Columbia, another in Tacoma, then one near Seattle. Always in shoes. Often without a body. Media outlets began to notice. The mystery of the floating feet, they called it. Theories abounded: serial killer, plane crash, suicide clusters, even body parts from natural disasters. But nothing was ever conclusively tied together. And the Silver King case remained the oldest of them all, the original ghost. At some point, the file became just another cold case. Technically active, but effectively dormant. There were no anniversaries, no vigils, no angry family members calling for justice. Just a silent drawer in a small-town sheriff's office, holding one severed foot and a very old question. By 2020, even I had nearly forgotten about it. Then, in 2023, the phone rang. It wasn't from the sheriff's office. It was from a company I had only heard about in passing, a small forensic lab in Texas doing something most agencies couldn't. They didn't just run DNA. They rebuilt it. From scraps. From dust. From the dead. The company was called Othram, and they were about to bring the foot back to life. I had heard of Othram before, but only on the margins. They were one of a handful of private labs pushing the edges of forensic science, doing the kind of work that sounded like science fiction just 10 years earlier. Not just identifying DNA, but building genealogical profiles from it. Mapping ancestry, finding distant relatives, and working backward to give the nameless their names again. In early 2023, the Clallam County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram to try something new. By then, traditional methods had given up everything they could. There were no active leads, no suspects, no obvious crime. But there was still one tool left in the box: forensic-grade genome sequencing in the emerging field of genetic genealogy. The process wasn't simple. First, Othram had to extract whatever viable DNA remained from the preserved tissue of the foot. The sample had been stored cold, carefully handled, but it was old, more than a decade submerged in evidence. In a lesser lab, that would have been a dead end. But Othram specialized in degraded samples. Their scientists rebuilt the genetic material molecule by molecule, slowly creating a complete DNA profile strong enough for comparison. Once that was done, they uploaded the profile to genealogical databases, with permission, of course. These weren't law enforcement databases like Cody's. These were public platforms, used by people curious about their ancestry, GED-match, family tree DNA. Millions of users had opted in to allow their data to help solve cold cases. It was digital detective work powered by DNA and crowdsourcing. But even that wasn't enough. Sequencing the DNA cost money. Running comparisons, hours of time. Clallam County didn't have a budget for a 15-year-old foot with no name. That's where DNA Solves came in, Othram's crowdfunding platform. A place where ordinary people could donate to help solve extraordinary mysteries. Within weeks, enough was raised to fully fund the testing. What happened next was stunning. Within days of uploading the profile, Othram's genealogists began building a family tree. Not just a list of matches, a map. They started with distant relatives and worked forward, combining genetic hits with public records, birth and death certificates, social media. It was laborious, like putting together a jigsaw puzzle with no box cover. But eventually, the lines began to point toward a single family in British Columbia. Then a name: Jeffrey Surtel.A. Born in the late 1950s. Lived in Mission, B.C., reported missing in April 2007. The pieces fit. The age matched. The location plausible. His DNA wasn't in any criminal database, but a relative's was in a genealogy platform. That was enough to find him. Enough to know. In a quiet office, someone picked up a phone and called the RCMP. Then someone else called his family. After 15 years, the foot had a name. But the mystery was far from over. Because now the question wasn't just who he was. It was how he ended up dead. In another country. Alone. Jeffrey Surtel.A left his home in Mission, British Columbia, around midnight on April 29, 2007. That's the last time anyone saw him. He was 50 at the time, quiet, private, with a small circle of friends and a close-knit family who had started to worry about him in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He wasn't the type to vanish. Not on purpose. Not without telling someone. But just past midnight, he took his bicycle and rode off into the dark. No note. No destination. No clue. His family reported him missing the next morning. I tracked down old Canadian news clippings, missing persons reports, forum threads where strangers still posted theories years after the case had gone cold. The RCMP had launched a search. Local volunteers combed nearby trails, rivers, roadsides. There were flyers, press releases, phone calls. But nothing ever surfaced. Not his bike. Not his wallet. Not a single trace. He had simply vanished. There were theories, of course. Some thought he may have experienced a mental health crisis. Others wondered if he'd been hit by a car and buried in a panic. But no evidence ever surfaced to support any version. After a few months, media coverage slowed. After a few years, the file went dormant. Until Othram called his sister. That phone call, over 15 years later, delivered a kind of answer no one saw coming. Not the one they'd hoped for, but something. The human foot found on a beach in Washington state in 2008 belonged to Jeffrey. There was no doubt. The DNA match was solid. There were relatives in the tree on both sides of his family. The probability was astronomical. It was him. But that raised another question, one far harder to explain. How did he end up in Washington? Mission B.C. is nearly 150 miles from Port Angeles. It's not a route someone accidentally pedals into, especially not without a passport, money, or any plan. The border crossing alone would have required paperwork and interaction. Yet there were no customs records, no surveillance footage, no confirmed sightings after that night in 2007. As far as the system was concerned, Jeffrey Surtel simply disappeared, and 15 months later, part of him washed ashore in a different country. I tried to piece it together, retrace what a person might have done in his shoes. Maybe he took a bus to Vancouver. Maybe he hitchhiked. Maybe he paid cash for a ferry and stayed off the radar. It's possible, if not likely. But it still left the central mystery intact. What happened to him after he crossed the border? If he died by suicide, there were no obvious signs. If it was foul play, there was no body, no scene, no witnesses. If it was an accident, it had left no trace but one, a foot, in a sneaker, perfectly preserved by time and salt water. His family, when reached, released a short statement. Though the circumstances of his disappearance remain unknown, we are grateful to finally have answers. It was dignified, calm, but reading between the lines, you could feel the years of waiting and the impossibility of closure when the ending is still so blurred. I kept coming back to the bike. People don't ride into the night for no reason. They go towards something or away from something. And whatever Jeffrey Surtel was doing that night, whatever road he took, it led to the sea. When I first heard that Jeffrey Surtel's foot had washed ashore in Washington, I thought it was tragic. But I also thought rare. A fluke. One of those once-in-a-career oddities that just happened to line up in the most unsettling way. Then I started digging. The first report I found was from 2007, almost a year before Surtel's foot was discovered. A left foot, encased in a size 12 Reebok, found on Jedediah Island, off the coast of British Columbia. Then another in 2008, this time in the same region. And then a third, all human, all detached cleanly at the ankle or just above, all wearing sneakers. It didn't stop there. Over the next decade, the number kept climbing. 14 feet, sometimes in pairs, sometimes alone, some matched to missing persons, others never identified. But the details were eerily consistent. Running shoes, relatively intact tissue, and no attached remains. News outlets dubbed it the Salish Sea Feet mystery, named after the waters that separate southwestern British Columbia and northwestern Washington. Theories erupted like wildfire. A serial killer dumping bodies offshore. Human traffickers. Secret prisons. Superstitions. The idea of killer currents or dismemberment rings. Some people thought the whole thing was an elaborate hoax. But none of those theories held up under scrutiny. Forensic scientists offered a more sobering and much less cinematic explanation. When a body ends up in the ocean, it begins to decompose. The ankle, with its complex set of joints and tendons, is one of the first places to separate. And modern sneakers? They float. They're made from lightweight materials that trap air. So while the rest of a body might sink or scatter, the feet drift, carried by currents for miles until they wash ashore. It made sense, but it didn't feel satisfying. I started mapping the locations, the coastlines, the tide patterns. I reviewed coroner's reports. In many cases, the deaths were ruled accidental drownings or suicides. In others, the cause was undetermined. But the sheer number of isolated feet made the public uneasy, and rightly so. There's something primal about it. A foot is not abstract. It's human. It suggests motion, escape, direction. To find one, alone, in a shoe, is to find the echo of a person cut short. What made Jeffrey's case stand out wasn't just that he was part of the pattern. It was that he may have been the first. His foot was the earliest confirmed case found in the U.S. side of the region. Before the story had a name, before the public was even paying attention, his discovery could have been dismissed as a bizarre one-off, and for years, it was. Now, with the benefit of time and pattern recognition, it feels like something else entirely, a bellwether. The first stone in a ripple we didn't understand until it had already passed. Some experts told me it's all explainable. No crime, no conspiracy, just coincidence, decay, and shoe design. But part of me wonders, how many coincidences does it take before we start asking different questions? And how many more feet are still out there, floating in silence, waiting for someone to care? After all the science, all the timelines, all the theories, it still comes down to this. One man rode into the night and never came back. 15 months later, his foot washed ashore in another country. 15 years after that, we learned his name. That's the story. That's all of it. And yet, it's not even close to enough. The identification of Jeffrey Surtel.A brought resolution. Technically, his family finally knew what happened, or at least, where he ended up. But the deeper questions still have no answers. How did he travel 150 miles without being seen? Why was there no sign of him for over a year? Did he die in the water? Or somewhere else, and the ocean just took what it could carry? Sometimes, we think a name is the same as a solution. It's not. A name is just a key. And in Surtel's case, it opens a door into something even more unsettling. The vast, quiet space where answers should be, but aren't. In the days after his identity was confirmed, I reached out to the Clallam County Sheriff's Office. I asked if there were any new investigative leads, now that they knew who he was. The response was polite, but brief. There are no indications of foul play. The case remains closed pending further evidence. That's it. Nothing more to add. I also reached out to the family. They didn't want to talk. And honestly, I don't blame them. What could anyone say? What comfort can be found in a single sneaker, returned by the sea? I went back to Silver King one last time. Not to find anything, just to see it, feel it. The resort is worse than before. The beach is rougher now, more overgrown. I stood at the spot where the shoe had been found, and I tried to imagine it. Not the discovery, we already know how that happened. I tried to imagine the moment before. Before the tide rolled in. Before anyone saw it. Just a lonely foot, drifting to shore. The final trace of a man who vanished. And then I remembered something. In one of the early reports, long before Othram, before DNA, before the name, there was a line in the evidence log, a second shoe found nearby, origin unknown. It was never tested, never matched. The official record never tied it to Surtel, and no further remains were recovered. But I wonder, what if that second shoe did belong to him? What if the rest of him is still out there, somewhere beneath the surface, beyond our reach, waiting? Jeffrey Surtel's name is back in the record books. His case is technically closed. But the sea doesn't keep time the way we do. It returns what it wants, when it wants. And sometimes, only in pieces. This wasn't a story about closure. It was a story about what remains, and what doesn't.